Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today for a conversation with Boys Town National Training. My name is Stephanie Emmerich and I'm your facilitator for today's webinar. Just a few things before we get started with our presenters. First off, we are recording this webinar, so you will get a link to this recording.
And we also will send out a packet of any materials, anything shown on the screen, anything like that. So don't worry about taking notes or if you're going to get the information, because you will get it at the end. So I want to introduce our presenters today and start out. I'm going to turn it over to you, Steph. Steph, we have Steph Jensen, and if you could just tell us about your experience with the Boys Town education model and your experience with Boys Town and anything else.
Hello. Yes, I'm Steph Jensen, and I have been with Boys Town for about 18 years. I started my career as a middle school teacher and went through one of my first professional developments. It was Boys Town, and it really changed my life professionally as far as giving me additional tools in the classroom. It was also at the time when I had my own kiddos at home that were little, and I took those skills home and used them with my kids also. So it not only transformed my professional life, it also had a huge impact on my personal life, which led me to moving from the classroom to working directly at Boys Town, supporting educators all over the world. So I'm excited to be here today.
Great, thank you, Steph. And we also have John McGuire here with us today. So John, if you could take a couple minutes and tell us about yourself and your experience with Boys Town.
Sure, thanks, Steph. Good afternoon, everybody. Again, my name is John McGuire. I've been with Boys Town since 1987, so a really, really, really long time ago. I've worked with the model in quite a variety of different capacities. My wife and I started out in the residential program, held several different administrative positions over the years, spent some time actually working in Boys Town schools, left for a period of time and actually taught in a area public school here in Omaha, and came back to Boys Town to my current position, where now I spend most of my time talking with most of the educators around the country and kind of listening to the needs that they have and seeing if some of our services and things will line up to help them, improve how they interact with their students. So yeah, that's kind of my story, and happy to be here. So thanks.
Great, thank you. So everyone who has joined us today, we really appreciate your time, and we've been doing these conversations throughout 2021, and so our topic today it's a conversation with Boys Town National Training, Hope for 2022. And one of those, it kind of fits with what we've been going through, and also thinking about the seasons that we're in. This is a wonderful time of the year to reflect on challenges, we've all had some challenges, we've all had some successes, we've all had some great lessons, and what can we build on and take into 2022? So Steph and John are here to talk to you today about that, share some ideas, information, strategies, and we have some also resources that we'll be sending it out after the webinar. So I'm going to turn it over to Steph and John to start setting up the foundation for our conversation. And let's talk about hope and what we can do and how we can build it for now and going forward throughout the year. And Steph, I made you the presenter, so if you have anything to share, you can do that.
I can share.
Yes.
Gotcha. All right. So this was a really fun conversation behind the scenes when we were kind of talking about what do we want to do in December. We know, hearing from our trainers in the field and talking to principals and educators across the country, it has been a lot. There's been a lot going on. And so we started thinking about, what can we give? What do we want to share as sort of a seasonal survival kit? And if we're going to choose one element that we would like to place in a seasonal survival kit, what would that be? And so we started thinking about, what do we want to spread? What can we spread? What would be a great super spreader at this time? And we thought hope. Hope would be something that would be fantastic if we can spread it, if we can put it in our seasonal survival kit. We really could create some great outcomes and a great outlook for not only staff in the schools, the boots on the ground, doing it every day, but also for our kiddos. And so we kind of landed on that concept of hope. And I love the quote you might have heard before of, you can live for 3 weeks without food, You can live 3 days without water. You can live 3 minutes without air, but you can only live for 3 seconds without hope. And so that's really what kind of drove this one key ingredient for a seasonal survival kit in schools is how can we, as educators, how can we spread hope? If we know that it's such a key ingredient to an overall positive outlook, how can we share that not only with one another as staff, but also with our kiddos, with our students in our classrooms? So we started to really kind of dive into that concept of hope and looking at how do you intentionally develop. If we know hope is so important, how do we generate that in the classroom? How do we do that in our schools? What's the lesson plan for hope? What's the curriculum for hope? And so it turns out that there's a lot of research in developing that hopeful mindset. And one of the key ingredients is setting goals, being able to set those goals and have that kind of goal-oriented thinking. Because when you start to identify those goals, those things that you want to achieve, those things that you want to work towards, then you start looking for different pathways. And those pathways start to create curiosity. And you get kids to start thinking about how to achieve that goal. And what we find as educators, I think we have a key role in not only laying out that roadmap for kiddos, but also helping them work through when they hit those detours. And I think that's a key piece for those pathways for us as educators and developing those relationships with kids and helping connect them with different pathways that they can still reach those goals. I know a lot of times, sometimes we feel like failure or defeat is an ultimate disaster, and especially our kids think that way. But we want to shift that to that more hopeful mindset that defeat isn't necessarily a disaster. And a lot of times it leads you to a detour. And detours oftentimes lead you to your greatest adventures. So how do we help connect them and help them find those side roads to develop, to reaching some of those goals, creating those pathways? And then the third concept under hope, building hope, was agency. And that is just believing in yourself, believing that you can, that there's a possibility that you can achieve those goals. And so as we started looking at these three things and really paralleling this or layering this on with social emotional learning, we're all really focused on social emotional learning. How does hope and SEL complement one another? How is our social emotional learning competencies, how is that really the foundation for hope? And we find that it really aligns nicely in that if we're going to develop that agency, it starts with understanding, having that sense of self-awareness, knowing what your strengths are, what does inspire you, what are some of the things that you really enjoy doing and are good at, and that's that component of self-awareness, which then ties nicely into setting those goals. So once we start to identify what our personal strengths are, what would be some goals? What would be some of those stretch goals, if you will, to help us become better in those areas? And that's that sense of self-management. And then the pathways is the social awareness. That's where I said, as educators, we can really be intentional about helping to create those pathways, build those alternate routes, if you will, for our kiddos, which then leads to that agency and being able to strengthen relationships and be able to think through some of that problem solving. So we really found that hope and SEL was really, they really are intertwined. And when we look at this concept of hope and tie it into the philosophy of social emotional learning, then that leads us to strategies. So what are those strategies? If our seasonal survival kit, if one of the key components in our seasonal survival kit is going to be hope, what strategies can we employ in the classroom to really develop or build hope in our students? And so that just really ties into the practices and the strategies that we utilize at Boys Town. And I'll pass that on to John to kind of talk through some of these different components.
Sure, thanks, Steph. I think as I think about the idea of hope, and I really look at it kind of in two ways. One is how that applies to the kids that we work with, but then also looking at it as us as adults, as educators. Hope, in my mind, hope comes from success, having some success along the way. And so if you look at some of the kids that maybe that you have in your classrooms, you have in your schools that are struggling for one reason or another, I think if we looked at kind of what their life is like, they're probably not experiencing a lot of success. They may not be having a lot of academic success. They may not be having a lot of success in the relationships that they have at school. If they're struggling there, they're probably having some of that same lack of success at home. And so without success, where does that hope come from? And same I think is true as educators. If we're not experiencing some success along the way with the kids that we work with, where does that hope come from? And so I think we have to be able to identify that small part of how we can help kids have some success. And so again, if you look at what our model really teaches is we have to teach those things. We have to teach kids those skills. And that's going to look different depending on the age of kids that you're working with. Certainly it's going to depend on their developmental level. Younger kids that tend to be maybe more kind of self-centered at that point, their success is probably going to come from something in the moment. And so teaching skills that can help them, maybe it's something as simple as how to follow directions, how to get along with each other, how to ask permission, how to, finish an academic problem, all those little things. If we can equip them with the kind of skills that they need so that they can feel success, breeds more success, breeds hope. And so I think it has to start there. I think as kids certainly get older, and more mature and more developmentally, moving along kind of the line there, they're looking less probably in the classroom and looking more outside. What's going to happen to me next? How does what you're trying to give me here, how does that mean anything outside of school? And so I think especially for older kids, boy, the skill to me of problem solving is huge. All those other things I think are important, the following directions and all those things. But I just think that problem solving is huge. Helping kids learn that they can have some control over what happens to them. They can have the kind of skills that they need to be able to solve problems, whether it's academically or in a relationship with their mom and dad, their boss, their boyfriend, their girlfriend, whatever the situation might be. They're just in a tough situation. Having the kinds of skills and the confidence that they have the kind of skills to be successful, that breeds hope. And so I think it has to be, I think it's really kind of that, that simple. Just again, to kind of give you another analogy, I was watching the Iowa Hawkeyes Husker football game on Saturday, and my Hawkeyes won, so I was pretty excited about that. The Huskers, I know a lot of you probably don't follow Nebraska football, can't blame you for that, but they set a record this year for the most losses in college history by 9 points or less, so single digits. And you could see it going through the course of the season. It was the same mistakes over and over and over. And you could tell the coaches were getting more frustrated as time was going on. And at the end of after the last game against the Hawkeyes in the news conference, one of the reporters asked the head coach, psychologically, geez, where is your team at after all these things that have happened over the course of the season? And he goes, in the first half we were playing great and we were winning. He said, but that blocked punt that led to a touchdown changed everything. And they said, well, what do you do about that? He said, obviously we got lots to work on. He said, but I know one thing, winning cures those things. Winning will cure those things. And so you look at it, teams that win a lot can make a mistake and still win. Teams that struggle, that don't have the kind of skills to overcome a mistake or an interception or a penalty, they keep losing. And so what is the difference? And to me, it's that success breeds more success and breeds hope. So I know it's kind of a long-winded explanation there to try and make a point, but it just was really, really clear to me that we have to be able to help kids experience some of those small successes, and that breeds hope. So again, we talk about what our model teaches is we are a teaching model. we believe in actively, not just actively teaching academics, but actively teaching social skills, because quite honestly, for kids to be successful in the classroom and beyond, those things are intertwined. It's not I'm going to teach math for 10 minutes and I'm going to teach a social skills for 10 minutes. They're intertwined. They have to be in order for kids to be successful. A big part of that then is practice. We can't just tell kids what to do. We want to actually practice. We don't just tell kids what to do academically and expect them to succeed. We want them to actually practice, walk the walk, talk the talk. That's where the real learning takes place. So that practice piece is critical. Modeling is also another powerful tool. If you've got strong relationships with kids, you should be what you want to see. Model what you want your kids to engage in. It's a very powerful tool. As a teacher, as an educator, there's always a kid watching you to see how you respond in a situation. And so the way you conduct yourself, the way you do the things that you want your kids to engage in, it can be a really powerful tool. And then next, we want to make sure that we're reinforcing the good things that kids do. Boy, a lot of times kids that struggle are getting reinforced and praised the least. And so the kids that need it the most are getting the least amount of it. And so getting better at finding those things, and sometimes they're small, especially for those kids that struggle. It's finding those small things and praising them and reinforcing them so that they can feel good about what they're doing. Success breeds hope. And then lastly, don't be afraid to correct inappropriate behavior or difficult behavior or interfering. We need to be able to correct it, but when we correct it, it should be done through teaching. So those are just kind of some 5 really key components that make up our model. We feel like it's a very powerful approach to how we work with kids. And then if we kind of flip that to our staff as educators, one of the consistent pieces of feedback that we get from folks that attend our workshops is we'll hear, I can't tell you how many times I've heard it. Teachers will say, well, now I feel like I can do something. I feel like I've got a plan. I feel like this one kid that that was in my mind the entire workshop when we were talking about all these challenges, and this one kid, now I feel like I know I've got a plan. I think I can do something to make a difference and to help. Again, hope. And that comes from those little successes. So that's where that's at. So Steph, I'll kick it back to you.
Yeah, no, I love that. And so we talk about, our seasonal survival kit, and we want to develop hope. I think that goes nicely to what are we going to teach? What are some of those seasonal survival skills that kids are going to need to get through the next 3 weeks? We all know as educators, this is a really hard time to teach historically, right? And then you add on some of the additional stresses that kids are experiencing and that we're experiencing, makes it a little bit more challenging. So what would be some of those seasonal survival skills that we want to teach intentionally during this time? And it might be some skills like asking for help or how to show gratitude. What are some things to be thankful for? I think that's a really key piece too, because John talked about using praise and reinforcement, and those kiddos that need it the most sometimes get it the least. And what science shows us is that when you feel more praise, when you feel that reinforcement, that builds confidence, and that also creates a sense of gratitude. And there's a lot of healing principles to a heart of gratitude or thankfulness. We know that when you start to list the things that you are thankful for, it releases serotonin, and serotonin is that happy hormone. And so how can we intentionally combine teaching those seasonal survival skills and then reinforcing those and tying them into that mindset of gratitude? Because we know all of those things build hope, which also builds resiliency. We'll set our kiddos and ourselves as educators up for success. So I think as we look at moving from the concept of hope and the philosophy of social emotional learning, it really ties into these strategies of teaching. And so I would challenge you to take that idea of teaching social skills and thinking about those seasonal survival skills for students, and go out and search for some of those lesson plans and boystowntraining.org is a great resource. Obviously, we have lots of fabulous lesson plans out there. I think with this webinar, you're also going to get some lesson plans on how to create thankfulness, how to create that gratitude in the classroom, so that we can really focus in this stretch before we break for the holidays on focusing on those top 4 areas. You'll see that those first 4 concepts or the first 4 strategies, we really focus on those before we get to that correction piece. So spending that time teaching those skills, giving opportunities to practice those skills, modeling them, and praising them, we spend a whole lot less time correcting. But when we do need to correct, it's still with that hopeful mindset. It's still with, when we correct, we want to teach. And if we teach it and they try it, we want to reinforce it. And so it really becomes a nice cycle to build hope in the classroom.
Well, and I think the other key piece of this too, that I think is quite obvious, but sometimes it's overlooked, is just that relationship that we have with kids. You know, it's just so important. You know, I think back to my own experience in school, at college. You know, I had some not so great teachers, had some great teachers, had some really great, you know, academic teachers, but the ones that I think really meant the most to me were not just good academic teachers, but they took, you know, I felt like they took an interest in me. They invested something in, you know, in me. And I'm sure we've all, you know, could all think back and probably pick out at least a handful of folks that we would probably say that same thing about. And it's just so true. You know, if you don't have a solid relationship with your students, it's hard to be a good teacher. You know, you might be able to stand up in front of your classroom and deliver the content in a professional, concise way. But if you don't have a solid relationship with those kids, that's only going to get you so far. And I can tell you from my own experience, I've seen it a million times, that relationship becomes even more critical when you're in a tough spot. You know, when the kid's maybe having some struggles, maybe self-inflicted or not, but is in a tough situation. If you've got a solid relationship with that student, that is going to allow you to say the kind of things and address behavior and confront those kind of issues in a much more effective way than you ever could if you don't have a relationship with that student. So it's just absolutely critical. And again, I think especially what's, you know, the challenges that everybody's gone through in the last coming up on 2 years, which is hard to believe. I just think it's even more important. You know, we still hear every day. Steph and I talk to people every day from around the country that there's still schools that have been fully remote this entire time, or some that are doing hybrid. And just, we all know, we hear it every day, the challenges that are going on and the stress that teachers are under and the challenges that they're being asked to do. It's just, it's a tough time. There's just no question. And so having those good relationships with kids, having some strategies, having a plan, again, just builds those small successes, and from that, I think breeds hope for everybody involved.
So thinking about what you're talking about, when we think about hope, and you know, you've talked about lots of keywords through here. I've heard resiliency over and over. Thinking about, you know, the resiliency really ties into that growth mindset and how that growth mindset really bases on hope. And although, John, you did pick on the Huskers, and I do like the sports coaching analogy type of thing to think about, because that growth mindset, again, you can make it through a lot more when you have hope, when you have resiliency, when you're looking at your glass half full. So when you're thinking about, can you guys talk about any, when you look at reinforcement, very often praise is one of those where it kind of gets a bad rap, when really it's a very powerful and effective tool. And can you talk about purposeful praise and how that is such a key in developing hope in the classroom?
Yeah, that's a good point, Stephanie. You know, again, I think it ties back into what we just talked about with relationships. You know, for you to reinforce kids, it's going to be real hollow if you don't have a relationship with kids. So we want to make sure that we've got that relationship, but we should be looking for things. And again, it's going to look different for every kid. You know, for some kids, again, if we look at some of the social skills that we teach, let's just take a very basic one. We talk a lot about following directions. And so we break that up into, 3 steps. You look at the person, you say, okay, and you do the task. And sometimes there's a 4th step you might check back. For some kids, it's fair for us to say, they should be able to get all 3 or 4 steps. And we want to make sure that we're reinforcing that if and when all 3 or 4 steps happen. For some kids, getting all 3 or 4 steps is going to be a huge challenge. And so rather than, you didn't say okay, or you didn't get the task done right away, and focusing on just that, which obviously can be more of a corrective or maybe more of a negative interaction, what are the smaller pieces in there that we can identify? For some kids, just getting them to look at us is a big step. For some kids, getting to verbalize and respond is a big step. And so again, if you understand behavioral principles at all, if you want behavior to improve or increase, it has to be reinforced. And so identifying those things and those little steps along the way builds that success, builds that hope. And the interesting thing to me about this is we do this kind of thing every day academically, but for some reason when it comes to behavior, sometimes as educators, as parents, as adults, we seem to struggle with that. But it really is very much the same thing. When we're teaching kids a new academic concept, we typically break it up into pieces and chunks and show kids how everything fits together, and we reinforce those things along the way. The same principle about how kids feel reinforced, how that builds success and builds hope is true with behavior and social skills, just like it is academics.
Yeah, and that's so true. And when you think about we hear in education oftentimes rigor, relevance, and relationship. And without a relationship, you don't know what's relevant, which means you can't stretch to rigor. And the same thing is with reinforcement. We can't be effective in praising kids or reinforcing kids if we haven't taken the time to get to know them, to build that relationship, to know what's relevant to them. So I think it's that whole being intentional about creating those relationships that we do for kids. And then we talk about praise in relationships, in all healthy relationships. Really, there's good work by the Gottman Institute under Dr. John Gottman, who, within a 93% accuracy rate, he can just observe the interactions between co-workers, partners in environments, and just by watching how much they reinforce one another as opposed to how many times they correct one another, can determine if those are going to be successful relationships long term. And what he's found is that really you need for the strongest relationships a 7-to-1 positive to negative interaction. So 7 praise or 7 reinforcements for every 1 correction is what he has found to be pretty consistent in healthy relationships. And so if we apply that into the classroom, trying to identify those relevant areas for reinforcement with our students to help them be more successful in relationships, we're going to help them long term, not only in the classroom, but whatever they choose to do outside of our school walls.
That's very good points. And as you were talking, I was thinking about, very often we think about, and questions I've gotten and seen over the years and everything is, oh, so I have to go around and tell my kids good job. I'm just, it's like this trophy society. And so praise and reinforcement isn't just giving a sticker for every before it's a response into a meeting expectations, meeting behaviors, and reinforcing that, and it's one of those things where we don't like to use the word contagious very much, but I want to use contagious with praise, because praise is the one thing that I think we could really have is when you start to really use it, it can become contagious, and it's one of those things that you want to catch and give to others. And can you give us some examples of ways that praise is effective, and some different levels of using reinforcement? It's not just always like, hey, great job, or you're not constantly walking around and and praising everybody for everything or reinforcing everything. Can you talk about some of that specificity? That's a tough word. And some of the shaping ways of how you can use some examples there.
Yeah.
Well, I would
Go ahead,
say,
Steph. Sorry,
oh,
go ahead.
go ahead.
No, that's all right. Go.
So I was just thinking as I kind of threw out the challenge of seasonal survival skills, one seasonal survival skill that might be good for our kiddos is how to accept a no answer. Because there may be some in the form of, you may not get everything you ask for on your holiday wish list, right? So you might have to accept a no answer. So we might teach that in the classroom of how to accept no, but we don't always get everything that we want. So we can teach that, and then when we see kids using that, when we give them a no answer in the classroom, we want to reinforce that. And the way to make that very specific is to tie that kind of general praise, like Stephanie said, good job, but moving beyond just the good job to good job accepting no. So they know exactly what they're receiving that reinforcement, what they're receiving that praise for, because then that helps to shape that it will happen again. When we just use those general praise statements, it feels good, but we don't know exactly what to do to get that same response again. We know that something good happened, but we don't know exactly what it is. And so we're more specific in tying it directly to that skill, then kids know exactly what to do in order to get that reinforcement again. And then we can move it into, if it's a really big no answer and they did a really excellent job, then we might also add a positive consequence. Because you did such a nice job of accepting no, I'm going to give you a little bit of extra time at the end of class for your own free time. So giving them sort of that little extra bonus so that they see that there is some benefit to them to continue to do that skill.
Yeah, I guess I just kind of piggyback on that. I think, Stephanie, you make a good point. If just praising just for praise sake, if it sounds hollow to you, it's going to sound hollow to your students. So it's got to be real and authentic. And again, I just think that comes from solid relationships with your kids, and being tuned into what it is that they're working at. So things like what Steph's talking about. If we've been having those conversations with kids along the way about their behavior, about those different skills, always whenever we can, tying those skills back into how we're interacting with kids. So, again, if I've got a student that's working on following directions, boy, anytime I see them follow directions, I want to make sure I let them know and praise them for following directions or whatever the skill might be. And again, if I've got a solid relationship with kids, I'm praising them and reinforcing them effectively and in a meaningful way. Again, that goes back to just those small successes. That's a chance for the kid to win. And again, winning breeds that hope and just becomes more of a just kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy there. The good momentum just kind of continues to go.
So thinking about when we're focusing on proactive and positivity here, which is going to help us stay in a nice area of hope and working towards that positive behavior, what are some challenges that people you've worked with have experienced of what kind of tips and best practices could you guys share when it comes to looking at the idea of teaching, practicing, modeling, reinforcing, and focusing on that? We know that it seems like, yeah, that makes sense, but what are some key takeaways that everybody should kind of leave with that we can start doing and kind of be aware of, so maybe we don't fall into those traps?
Well, that's a good question. I think the first thing that kind of comes to my mind, I think, the time that I spent in the classroom, and I'm sure Steph would say the same thing. I think anybody that's been a teacher for any length of time, it seems like we've always had at least one kid in there that just seems to feed off negative attention. And how disruptive that can be to your interactions with them and how disruptive that can be to other kids, and what you're trying to accomplish in a classroom. And so, helping them begin to learn that they can get their needs met and get the attention that they need and that they obviously desire through positive behavior it certainly can be a big challenge. And I think it's doable, but I think we also have to realize, they didn't get where they are overnight. You're certainly not going to change it or fix it overnight. It's going to be a long process. And so that's where it kind of goes back to what we talked about a little bit earlier, is really kind of identifying those small steps along the way, and reinforcing those small steps along the way and being consistent with that. And then also, I think, the other piece that we haven't gotten into a whole lot is that correction piece, is when those behaviors happen, that we do correct those things. Sometimes we tend to ignore it, kind of hoping that it goes away. It usually doesn't. But correcting that behavior, and again, correcting it through teaching. But it's that consistent approach that will, hopefully over time, begin to have that student learn that, again, they can get their needs met through more positive behavior than negative. But then again, another big piece of that is, a lot of times with those kids that are super challenging, a lot of times we only address the problem when it's a problem. And so finding those neutral times when it's not in response to maybe a negative behavior, but finding those neutral times where we can sit down with kids. And it's obviously it's challenging when you got a classroom full of kids. I'm going to pretend like it's not, but finding those neutral times where you can maybe sit down, talk with that student about, hey, here's what I'm seeing. Hey, I noticed this. It seems like you're having a hard time with this. Or I noticed when, so-and-so you says something in class, you do some of these things. And having that conversation at a neutral time where it might be a little less threatening, where that student may be a little less defensive, and being able to address some of those things. And again, is that going to magically cure it? No, it is going to take time and persistence on your part. But again, I can also tell you from my own personal experience, when we've gone go into classrooms to coach and consult, it's not unusual for a teacher to say, hey, I'm having trouble with this particular kid. And to a T, it goes back to what Steph was talking about, some of that data that you see about 7 positives to 1 negative interaction. Almost every time when we're looking at those kids that are the tough kids or the challenging kids, that ratio is flipped. It might be 7-1 the other way, or it's 4-1 the other way, or maybe at best it's 1-1. And so they're just, now again, you might say, well, gosh, their negative behavior is kind of dictating that. Well, there's some truth to that, but we can't let that drive the bus. We can't let that negative behavior just continue to dictate how those interactions continue to go. So again, not that it's a magic bullet, but that's usually the first place, at least for me in the interactions I've had with teachers. I'm like, let's at least start there. Let's flip that script. And, over the next, whatever defined period of time we're going to look at, let's make sure every day we're hitting at least 4-1, if not higher. At a minimum, we're going to shoot for that. And let's see over time if that begins to maybe impact some of their behavior. So I guess if you're looking for tips and trick, I guess that's where I would, especially for those tough kids, that's where I would encourage people to start.
Steph, do you have anything with how, like, I was thinking about, just sometimes it's so hard to find something, when you have those tough kids and they keep giving you more to correct than praise, how do you find things to reinforce?
We have to be the best investigator in the room. I mean, you just have to be intentional about it. We go with it, and we might be observing a certain student, or we might just be observing the overall climate. Even if a student seems like to us as an educator that they're constantly off task, what generally is that maybe at the worst they might be 60% of the time off task, but that means there's 40% of the time that we're missing some of the good things that they're doing. And I think sometimes also we have these super high expectations and that they should just know how to do school. And especially, I'll speak as from a secondary mindset of, they've been in school for 8 years. They should know that they're supposed to get in here on time and sit down in their seat. Well, they've been in school for 8 years, and maybe that's why they don't know, because maybe different teachers have had different expectations. Some teachers let it slide, some teachers don't. And so by the time they get into 8th grade, 9th grade, they're like, well, some teachers do, some teachers don't, so I don't know. And so we have to be intentional about just praising even the tiny things that we might take for granted. Well, they should just do that anyway. We have to shift our mindset to focus on the 40% that they're doing right, because the more we focus on that 40%, we're going to increase the 40 to the 60, and then they're going to be only 40% of the time off task. So we're having to correct less frequently.
So really, like, we think about that whole phrase of, well, they should know that by now, or they should have known better. I mean, that's the one that you think of. What do you say with, well, they should know that by now, and they should know better?
My response always is, if they've been in school for 6 years, how many teachers have they had? 6 at least, probably closer to 12, 15, 20 if they've moved around at all. So you think about that all those teachers that they've had, all those teachers had the same behavioral expectations? Did all those teachers actually teach those behavioral expectations? Probably not. And so if we don't take the time to intentionally teach that ourselves, we're leaving our kiddos to their own devices, and they're going to choose from the potpourri of teachers that they've had in the past, and they're going to use the skills that they like the most. So I just think that we have to shift that mindset where we would never expect an 8th grader who had never taken algebra to be able to do a trigonometry problem. We just wouldn't expect that, because we know that there's a lot of things that have to be taught in between in order to build that knowledge or that competency. And behavior is no different. Social emotional competencies are no different. There's a lot of building blocks to get to what we might think is a very common behavior, like accepting a no answer. You should know how to accept no. Well, if no one's actually ever taught them how we want it to be done in our classroom or in any sort of a career environment, and we leave it to the way that they've done it at home, which is when they go to the grocery store, mom says no, and then I just keep begging and begging and begging and have a meltdown, and then mom says, okay, just stop. You can get it. Well, that's not how we want them to accept no in school, right? That's probably not how they're going to be able to accept no in an employment situation. So we want to teach that regardless of what age, so that we know that they at least have that foundational understanding of how to accomplish some of those basic behaviors.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, because I just think there's so many correlations between how kids learn academically and how we teach academically, and again, going back to the behavior side of it. If a kid's in 4th grade, we would expect that they would have, at least fourth grade level math skills. If they're in 10th grade, we would expect that they at least have 10th grade, English skills and all those kinds of things. But we all know that that's, in most cases, or at least in many cases, that's not true. And while we probably get frustrated by that as teachers and educators, we don't quit with that. We accept that that's the reality. And so what do? We adjust how we teach our academics to meet the needs of each kid. And so we do what we need to do in order to meet the needs for where that student is at, in that particular academic situation. So why is that not the same when it comes to behavior? We don't want to accept the fact that they should know better. Well, okay, maybe they should, but they don't. And so do we just keep passing them along? And the next person said, well, they should know better by now. Pass to the next person along that says, well, they should know better by now. We have to do better than that. And again, I think if we can just kind of accept the fact that academics and behavior are learned very much the same way, they're taught very much the same way, and we really should have kind of the same headset in how we address both.
Well, and that, very good points there, because I'm looking at, again, the teach, practice, model, reinforce, correct is not only the steps that we should use with our students, but as I'm hearing and listening to you, I'm thinking, well, that's also the steps I would need to use myself to become good at it and to do that, because being a good reinforcer is going to take practice, and being a good teacher, as we all know, takes practice and takes learning and takes our own correction. Sometimes we have to self-reflect and look at things that we can do in different ways. So, they're very simple strategies, and I'm going to go back to our sports analogies again too. A lot of these are very fundamental things that we're talking about, like you both have said. You wouldn't expect a student who doesn't know algebra to do trigonometry. You wouldn't, we have to practice the fundamentals before we can actually, and we have to continue to review those fundamentals and reinforce those types of things when our kids get off track. And so there's a lot here of where it's been a great conversation about just some basic strategies to think about. Just doing these simple things can really develop hope. So we're getting to we have about 14 minutes left. And if there's any questions, I want to really encourage people to share them in the chat box and ask anything that you want about strategies, challenges you've had, planning for 2022, any of those types of things. And also, as we're waiting for those questions and talking about things, Steph and John, I'm going to put you on the spot and talk about if you can share your top hope tip for 2022. And then I'm also going to pull up the Boys Town website to show where we have some additional resources, as we talked a lot about different strategies for proactive teaching, correcting behavior, and all of those types of things. So I want to share with everyone who's on here some places that they can find that on the website. But while I'm doing that, if you guys can share some of your top tips for developing hope in 2022.
Okay.
Who wants to go first?
Oh, I can jump in. I guess the first thing that comes to my mind is making it a real priority to maybe connect with a kid that nobody's connecting with, because every school's got them. And again, just really kind of trying to establish some kind of a relationship and having some kind of a connection with the student that maybe just isn't really connected. So again, I think if you look at those kids that are hopeless, it's because they don't win much. There's not a lot of winning. There's just not a lot of success that they've had that they're having. And so, sometimes just that one person that can reach out and connect with that one kid can make such a difference. So I guess if I was going to say, well, I'm looking for that one thing, it's maybe just identifying that one kid out there that just doesn't seem to have that connection, and trying to make one, and having that kind of as my starting point, and then certainly building on the rest of the things that we discussed today. I guess that would be probably where I would start.
I think that's a really good point. And we talk about you don't have to have the relationship first. Part of the relationship is using that reinforcement, using those tools to build those relationships, because then you're going to see that, too often we're on a negative vicious cycle. So let's get on that positive merry-go-round. And so it keeps building and going around in that way. So putting yourself out there and making that one step. So Steph, what do you have to share with us?
Yeah, and so I think that's a great one too, to develop those relationships. And I would add on to that, caring for yourself. I think having some of that self-care, that personal wellness, creating that attitude of gratitude. I know Stephanie said earlier it can be contagious. It absolutely is. And so I think if we can be intentional of just identifying those things each day that we are thankful for, that really does a lot for us to be able to give more. I think that we ask so much of educators that sometimes we can just feel buried. And so we need to take a minute to kind of step back, focus on those things that we are thankful for, those things that kind of that attitude of gratitude, so that we're filling our own bucket so that we can do the same for our students.
Yeah, that's very true. It's again, in that whole idea, I think of when we think about the hope and positive attitude and finding some successes and reinforcing those successes and focusing on that positive makes you feel it's you're giving a gift to yourself too, and that's one of the things of where it's really it's almost a selfish thing to be positive and reinforcing, because that makes you feel good. And then the better you feel, the more you go. I just realized the other day, as I have some Alexas in my house, and every time I ask them to turn on and off the light, I always say please and thank you. And it's just one of those natural things. I'm like, that's a good practice. It's a good practice to be in, to say please and thank you, even to the inanimate objects that open up or that turn on and off my lights. But it's just become such a second nature picture of things and those easy words that start to come in that really can make you feel better, and it's a gift you can give yourself.
Well, I think,
Okay.
oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay, well, I was going to say, I think kind of going along with that, and what Steph's talking about, the world, it seems like it's just such a crazy place with COVID and politics and all the craziness and all the challenges that teachers, certainly face these days. If we kind of flip that, though, I think teachers are kind of lucky because they've got their group of kids and they can have those kids in their classroom and they can shut their door and they can kind of have a lot of control over their own little world right there. And if it's only for a short time, not worry so much about all that other garbage that's going on outside and really just focus on my kids in my classroom and what I need to do for them and meeting their needs and creating a kind of environment where maybe it's just for that 45 minutes a day where it's calm, supportive, peaceful learning's taking place, all those things that make everybody feel good. So I guess I would just continue to encourage people and a lot of times it's just about the headset that we want to have and keeping things in perspective.
And think about the major modeling lesson that by doing that you're giving to your students, because then you're also showing them like the importance of being in the here and now. Don't worry about what's going to happen. Don't worry about what happened before you walked in the door or what's going to happen after. Focus on the here and now and then see how that helps you going forward. And that's a really good thing too, because so often we get so involved in what's going to happen later or what happened yesterday or what happened 5 minutes ago. And if we just, like you said, focus on what you can control in that time and focus on the positives and sharing that attitude of gratitude and that little bits of control that you do have, those are very powerful, simple things that we can do. So great. So hopefully everyone who's joined us today has, taken away some thoughts, ideas, tips to think about building and sharing hope, not only through this wonderful holiday season that we're going into, but into 2022 and whatever we have to face going forward, we can all have hope. We're all in this together. You have wonderful resources. I know John and Steph are here for any questions, any types of things that you have. Anyone who is on the webinar today or is watching this in the recording or shares this with anyone else. But if you're also looking for resources, and many of you might already be very familiar with this, but I do want to take a moment to share the Boys Town Training website, because this is where the recording will be shared. But if you come to the website, if you go to resources, this is a great area for all of the things that we've talked about. We threw a lot of different strategies out there and talked about the importance of being proactive and reinforcing and having conversations of teaching for correction. And that all takes practice and that all takes different ideas and takes, sometimes we need those check-ins and those refreshments and ideas. And so we have lots of additional free webinars here. So if you can see that, we have all of our previous conversations from the year, but we go back years and years for things on effective correction. We have information on trauma-sensitive strategies, restorative justice, PBIS, and the Boys Town education model, all kinds of topics. These are all free, very short resources that you can access anytime. Also, we have lesson plans and activities. And so there's lots of different lesson plans and activities for ages, skills, those ideas, all of those types of things and throughout that. And then also for attending today and watching the recording, we will also be sharing with you this packet that we have is Praise in the Classroom. It's a lesson plan and guide, and this is a way to really focus on passing praise on. One of those things that we do want to share and give to others during this time of year, but not only this time of year, but throughout the year. So this is has a fun little packet that we'll be sending out to you too. So lots of different resources that we can share with you, and always come back often because we have more resources that we add to the website, and and continue to do this, and we'll continue to have conversations with Boys Town National Training in 2022. So if I don't see any other, where are the workbooks for the meeting needed for the meeting next week? I'm not sure what, are you having a training next week, Samantha? Is that, if you can send that message to us in the chat, we'll figure out what you're needing, and if there's any other questions that anyone has. But we really want to thank you again for your time today and joining us, and we wish you all a very happy holiday season and a lot of hope, and using these strategies to continue to build hope and make that contagious. And if you have any other questions, but that's all we have. And John and Steph, do you have anything that you want to share?
Nope. Thanks for everybody's time. Appreciate you joining us.
Okay, so Samantha, just let us know what workbook you're needed for the meeting next week, and we'll try to figure that out for you. But everyone else, thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to having you join us again in 2022. I can't believe I'm already saying that. Seems crazy. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.